The recent assassination of Charlie Kirk should make us realize something very apparent that wasn't really apparent to us before. Something that people would claim to have, claim to possess, but in reality did not, because of the hiddenness in our own dialogue between each other. It should make us realize that although both the right and the left look at each other and make claims about how they understand each other's fundamental beliefs, until last week, until that assassination, I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. It should be no surprise to anybody that we in our culture in America have lost any sense of having a real or dignified or intellectual conversation about philosophy, about what undergirds our philosophies, philosophy in communal life, even philosophy in our education systems. We aren't too keen on discussing ideas in a cordial and real way because we have essentially reserved our own ideas and reserved what we believe to be only allocated towards the privacy of our own home. And then anything within public discourse with regards to discussing ideas, most people see as fundamentally a form of combat, of ideological combat, instead of actually having a dialogue about trying to, or a dialogos about trying to achieve or understand a higher state of existing, a higher state of being. While there had always been critiques from the right going towards the left, saying that the left is not willing to engage in dialogue, the left is not willing to engage in conversation, et cetera, until last week, there was still this open possibility that that could be the case. However, when we look at Charlie Kirk's assassination and then the subsequent response from the left, it becomes clear that deep within the left, maybe not apparent to the obvious or self-evident to a leftist at face value, there is this deep cultural, philosophical, and ideological belief that ultimately, if somebody does not agree with you, or if you cannot beat them in this form of ideological combat through a discourse or through debate, therefore you can kill them to achieve the potential utopian vision of the future that you believe everybody should be privy to. And this is important because prior to last week, there's been political assassinations, both by people on the right towards people on the left and from people on the left towards people on the right. But this was a monumental assassination in the sense that there hasn't really been a influencer, not a political candidate in any sense, not somebody who is directly involved in our political process with regards to holding office being killed. There's something unique about that, and there's something different about that type of killing. And on a philosophical level, what it's done is that it's exposed the reality that on the left, there is this deeper divide between the sort of subculture of philosophical Marxism and then the typical advocates of progressive liberalism, which has its roots more in typical Enlightenment philosophy. This is an extremely important distinction, often that many people on the right fail to actually establish. It's a basic categorical distinction of what is actually on the left that is sorely recognized by most people. And instead, people will make broad statements that all people on the left are insane, crazy, or they're all violent, they're all this, they're all that. And then subsequently, people on the left will make claims about the right that they're all authoritarian, they're all fascist, etc. Everybody's familiar with this type of dialogue. However, what happened in the past week really exposed for the general public what happens when you actually take things like Marxism, things like these forms of Marxism that adopt postmodern categories, what happens when you take these things to their logical conclusion, especially when faced with the current Trump presidency, which some people might characterize as leaning towards more authoritarian, not necessarily fascist or anything like that, but at least more authoritarian, centralizing authority to the executive office. And so there's been this unveiling, this revealing to the general public, to the general zeitgeist, the spirit of the public, that, okay, there's something wrong when we take these things to their logical conclusion that could drive some 22-year-old to go kill for a person that, for all intents and purposes, was a moderate. Many people have spoken to this point before, and many people are continuing on the right and the left, continuing to parrot these sort of points. But what I'm sort of trying to point out is the reality that there's a deeply philosophical unveiling that is going on here. There's something that was sort of hidden to the general public. Maybe some people knew it explicitly or knew it subconsciously, but now it's become much more apparent, which is that when we take these sort of progressive Marxist ideologies to their logical conclusion. And there's nothing real, nothing ontological to actually ground these beliefs in Marxism. The logical conclusion is that if there's somebody that in any way stands in a staunch opposition to what you believe, or is a staunch deterrent towards you achieving this utopian Marxist vision, you have the moral justifications to actually take them out, to kill them, to remove them. If your own power is not enough to be able to beat them on the battleground of ideology or the battleground of ideas, discourse, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that Marxism is going away anytime soon. At this point, not even just in the history of America, but just in the history of Western culture and Western politics, there is something at this point fundamental to the canon of how we discuss ideas, to the canon of how we do politics, in which these progressive forms of Marxism are going to have their place. And in fact, one can even say they're not entirely completely useless. However, when we actually look at what Marx says, there is implicit in Marxist thinking, implicit in the internal logic of Marxism, the belief that there should be or there ought to be some form of violent revolution in order to achieve the stateless classist utopia that Marx so desired. And so when you have people that have adopted these forms of cultural Marxism, they're going to look at people on the right as fundamentally opposed, or even people on the left that are, let's say, more pro-capitalist, more pro-free market, and even more so pro freedom of religion, or even sometimes freedom of speech. They're going to look at those people and they're going to essentially postulate that these people are fundamentally, ontologically, a deterrent towards the reality, the utopian, stateless classist utopia that I want to achieve. And so they believe that they have the moral ability to take them out. And Marxism is not going to go anytime soon, but what it does make us realize is that when we remove the veil from what can actually happen, or we remove the naivete to think that all political ideologies can somehow coexist nonviolently, it demonstrates to us that, okay, there's these internal logics in some of these philosophies that can end in somebody, a 22-year-old that, for all intents and purposes, was successful, had gotten fully accepted to a college with a full ride, will should make someone like that ultimately go down a path of violence. And there's something real that we have to discuss. If there's something important when we're looking at something like Marxism, that we have to be honest with ourselves about the dangers of such an ideology. And there's dangers implicit in every political ideology, but perhaps in America, this was one of the first real turning points, no pun intended, that shows us and demonstrates to us that Marxism is not just this inherently utopian vision of society alone. It's a utopian vision of society that will and has, since its origin, advocated for forms of violence. This doesn't mean that every person who's a Marxist, or maybe, let's say, more strictly a softer form of Marxism, they might not advocate for violence in the same way, and they might be a neo-Marxist and have a different interpretation and implementation of Marxist philosophy. But there is a danger to it, ultimately, just as there is a danger with any political system or philosophy. However, what is also fascinating has been the response from the right to this conflict. Many people, especially with the rise of more of these far right ideals, which many people are looking down upon, many people are criticizing, there was an expectation from most people that there was going to be some violent revolution. There was going to be an overthrowment. And all this talk, even in young people, of fascism and authoritarianism, and this movement towards more forms of government that assert strength and dominance, and sort of these Machiavellian visions of how we ought to be as a society, and sort of the co-option of Christianity and older forms of even medieval Christianity to sort of claim that somehow Jesus would want some violent overthrowing or pushing out of immigrants in the country. Despite all that being there, what we saw was, from a response on the right, that there was actually, for the most part, a genuine embodiment of Christian ideals. There were still the people that were going to call for violence. There were still the people that were going to advocate for this Machiavellian assertion of power, this sort of Machiavellian Hobbesian assertion of power. But nonetheless, what we see when people are actually properly living out the Christian message, you see people holding vigils all across the world. You see people actually adopting a nonviolent stance. And that's the true power of Christianity, if it's actually embodied in an ethical and meaningful way. So if you actually look at the person of Christ, he did not advocate for a ultimate church-state union in which there's going to be some complete assertion of Christian dominance over society. The idea, at least from the real Christian ethic, the real Christian ethos, is that through love, you will promulgate and prompt a culture that will have the dignity of the human person fundamentally at play. And that's what's been demonstrated through, on a philosophical, perhaps even a theological level, through this assassination, is that when you see the internal logics of these systems at play, despite all the talk, despite all the rhetoric, despite the ideological debate and discourse, ultimately, when you embody these ideologies and philosophies and even theologies in existential life, one will ultimately result in radical violence and the justification for even killing an innocent person. And one will advocate, even if there has been a great horror committed, one will ultimately, if embodied to the fullest, advocate for love and forgiveness. And that is the message that Christ puts forward. And that is the message that we have to remember. Because the political, no matter how it manifests, is always going to be, in a certain sense, um, after culture, and then what comes prior to culture is ultimately philosophy. And then one can postulate their own various reasons for what comes before philosophy. But no matter which way you swing it, first we have ideas, then we have those ideas enjoined in community, and that forms culture, which is socially embodied beliefs and practices. And then from there, we form political communities. How do we promulgate these socially embodied beliefs and practices? And that is ultimately the political. And so what we've seen, and what we've, this stark contrast as that has been revealed to us, sort of an unveiling in our culture now in the political, is that when you take the internal logics of these ideologies to their ultimate limit, one prioritizes the dignity of the human person, one prioritizes a dignity of the human person because it's fundamentally predicated on an ontological dignity of the human person outside of merely the material. And then another side, deep within its internal logic and Marx's dialectical materialism, we see that there can be a co-option of human dignity for the sake of political ends or utopian visions of society. That's an important thing to remember, is that ultimately there doesn't mean that everybody on the left is bad actors. And in fact, most people on the left that are Kennedy age proponents of leftism or liberalism, they ultimately are being animated by the belief that people should be free to do what they want and shouldn't be bothered by others. And people should be able to do what they want as long as they're not harming other people. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. However, we have to ask ultimately in our culture, and we've lost this ability to have a true philosophical debate about these topics of human dignity. What does it mean to be a human person? What is human nature? And while the left, unfortunately, does not have this coherent narrative, which is why you get things and issues like discussing the viability of a child within the womb and abortion, or the euthanasia, whether or not we should eliminate or end the life of an elderly person if they so wish, if they're not as functional to society or as utility based to society. And you have that on the left, but on the right, there's a clear articulation, at least those on the right that are truly Christian, a clear articulation on the right of there's a dignity that I cannot take because I'm not necessarily my own. I was born into this world and I belong to my family. I belong to other people. I belong to, at least when the Christians, I belong to God. And in a sense, that distinction has become ever more apparent, and we can't forget that. Because if we forget that and we go back to sort of how things were prior to this assassination, we're going to continue to have these talking points over each other. But ultimately, the right has to get rid of these Machiavellian, Hobbesian assertions of power by the state and just truly live out the Christian message, live out the idea that there is an immutable and fundamental dignity of the human person, and no one should be treated as a means to an end. There's this notion in Catholic bioethics and Catholic ethics called the personalistic norm, which says that you can never treat another person merely as a means to your own end. And meanwhile, when you look at much of leftism, not all, but much of leftism, which is all very often predicated on utilitarianism, there is an idea, well, utilitarianism speaks of ideas that you cannot use other people as a means to an end. There is this internal logic of utility that sometimes people, if they're not intellectually learned enough, are not going to be able to embody to the fullest degree. But Christians fail at this. It's not to say that all Christians are perfect and all people on the right are perfect. But there is something fundamental to what we've seen, is that there was no political violence, retaliation from the right. Instead, there was, beautifully so, an embodiment, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, an embodiment of Christian values. You have to remember that going forward, that this isn't about just simply political ideology. This is deeper. We have to ask these fundamental questions about what is actually animating the right, what is actually animating the left, what is the spirit of this time, both on the right and the left, and what are the internal logics of these philosophies? Where did they come from? Where are they going? What do they want? What are their fundamental claims about reality? When we start to ask these questions, you can make light of a situation like this and understand a situation like this in a much more real, honest, and critical way.